Thanks for having me, and thanks to the panel for taking the time to be involved in this. Hopefully there'll be some good outcomes. What I want to propose is really very modest and is only part of the solution compared to what Steve and Peter have been talking about. And for me, there's an element of unfinished business with this because I tried to get this thing off the ground in New Zealand and it didn't work. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that. And that is basically a small but very impactful, not-for-profit journalism, investigative journalism unit funded by high net worth individuals and the public at large through crowdfunding. I run a unit called the Science Media Centre based here in Wellington. Steve Mahari was integral actually to the setting up of that when he was an MP back in 2006, 2007. We are all about evidence-based reporting of science-related issues, everything from climate change to stem cell research to nanotechnology. And the reality is in New Zealand we don't have any full-time science reporters left, not one. The last one was made redundant from RNZ last year, Veronica Maduna. So we're dealing with all these general reporters who are trying to cover really complex science-related issues. You don't see our name in the media. We work behind the scenes with all these people who are trying to do the best they can with very limited resources. And sometimes they do a really good job, but there is the imperative of clickbait journalism, so sometimes we're aghast at the science-related content that is being syndicated from the Daily Mail and others. But that aside, a few years ago I was looking at the structure of the Science Media Centre. Our budget's about $750,000 a year. There's 4 of us. We're supported by the Academy of Scientists. And I thought this is actually potentially a good structure for quite a modest setup where you could get 4 or 5 investigative reporters. There's so many of them that were leaving the mainstream media and are leaving the mainstream media. Is there enough appetite to fund a crack team of 4 or 5 people, supported legally and with governance board and all that sort of thing, to go after the big stories? So I went to America. I was lucky to get a Fulbright scholarship to go and visit some of these organizations in the US, and I spent time at ProPublica in New York and the Center for Public Integrity in Washington. Their budgets are about $10 million a year, and they're raised from big foundations. They get big grants, $4 or $5 million grants. They've now been very successful at raising money from the public as well. Really on the back of this crisis that's happening and the political mood in the US, we've seen ProPublica, for instance, raise more money in the first month of 2017 than it did in the entirety of 2016. So there's more money coming to these organizations because people want to support organizations that are speaking truth to power and that sort of thing. So I went to the US, I looked at these amazing organizations. I looked at ProPublica at one particular project called Dollars for Docs, where back in 2013 there was no disclosure regime that looked at payments between pharmaceutical companies and doctors. And it's a huge business in the US. Paying doctors to incentivize them to sell your drugs is making some doctors millionaires. And there was no disclosure regime. There's no disclosure regime for that here in New Zealand either. But what we saw in 2012 and 2013 was a lot of lawsuits against GlaxoSmithKline and Pfizer and these companies. And the outcome of those lawsuits was that they had to disclose these relationships on their websites. So ProPublica did a massive data journalism project to bring all of that information together, make it searchable, so that anyone could go in and see if their doctor had been given financial incentives or had been flown to a conference at the expense of the drug company. That whole project resulted or fueled a move to create what's called the Sunshine Act, which is now legislation in the US which mandates that public disclosure. So for me, it was an incredibly powerful example of, with relatively modest resources, you can actually bring about huge change. And I came back from America fired up about this. Could we do a mini ProPublica here in New Zealand? And we spent a year, a group of journalists, coming up with a structure for this thing. We called it Public Eyes. We got not-for-profit status, which was actually incredibly easy, much easier than I expected it to be. And then it fell over, and it died for a myriad range of reasons, but it didn't die for lack of appetite from those high net worth individuals and from the public. What killed it was that it was a bunch of journalists that was running this thing, and we needed a broader church, which is why I think having Action Station and maybe people that Lance Wigg knows in business and in technology, these are the sorts of people and skill sets that we need to make something like this work. So for me, I think, there is scope to do a mini ProPublica. When I came back from the US, I looked at the philanthropic scene here, and it's over $2 billion a year that we give in one form or other every year. It's a lot of money. Could we capture a tiny sliver of that, 1% of that, to go towards a fund that would fund public interest and investigative journalism? The simple answer is we just don't know, because no one has ever tested it. But I think that the appetite is growing. We've seen, for instance, the spin-off raise, I think, more money than they expected to for journalistic projects, tens of thousands of dollars. So I think there is appetite. The platforms are more available than ever. But what it really needs is a shot of investment at the sort of $1 million mark level from high net worth individuals who are willing to keep their hands off it the way that the investors in ProPublica and Centre for Public Integrity have done. Is there that appetite out there, for instance, that we've seen with the Next Foundation and environmental causes? Is it there for fundamental public interest journalism? I just don't know, but we haven't tested it, so I'd like to see that happen. It's a modest thing, it's only part of the solution, but perhaps if we could raise a couple of $1 million, we could replicate that ProPublica model where you have journalists working on the most impactful stories and then partnering with the mainstream media outlets to get those eyeballs, to get that readership and viewership that those big platforms can bring to it. That's how ProPublica works. They're not just putting it on their website, they're partnering with the New York Times, with CNN, to produce Pulitzer Prize-winning journalism. If we could do a mini ProPublica, that would be part of it. It's not the whole solution, but it's something that hopefully collectively we could at least test a case, because we never got to do that. Thanks.
Oh, tēnā koutou katoa. So I'm Jan Rivers. Thank you, Marianne and Action Station, for the opportunity to talk to you today and to take part in the People's Commission on Public Broadcasting and the Media. I'll tell you a bit about myself. I'll talk about the Scoop Foundation. I'm a trustee of the Scoop Foundation, and then I'll sort of broaden out into some of the solutions that I think might be possible. My involvement mainly has been as an activist on the issue of the public good. And for the last 2 years, my focus has been on open government and access to information for democracy. And there are some very interesting stories there if I had the time. But I'm also as trustee of the Scoop Foundation. It's the trust that's the owner of Scoop Publishing. And our role is in support of public funding for public interest journalism. The Scoop Foundation is seeking to become a registered charity, a process that's well advanced. Scoop Foundation raised about $100,000 in 2016, and we want to raise at least $80,000 this year. Our points of difference as a news service are an ethical paywall, a supremely good search engine, high-quality content curation, and a supporter membership of over 1,000. We're just about to start our second piece of crowd-funded investigative journalism on the recent earthquakes. The first was a piece by Alison McCulloch on postnatal depression. A recent innovation was a trial of Polis, and Polis is a piece of software that supports large-scale public engagement, and it speaks to Steve's comment about how do we create conversations which take input from all sides of the spectrum rather than us each living in our bubbles. And the topic that we chose was the different perspectives on the sugar and obesity debate. And it was partly being aware of the need for the problems faced by the media are wicked problems. They're multifaceted, as the previous Peters and the other presenters have made clear. So, why is public broadcasting and media critical? The popular philosopher Alain de Botton wrote that once our formal education's finished, the news is the teacher. It's the single most significant force setting the tone of public life and shaping our impressions of community beyond our own walls. When the news fails, a society becomes dangerously unable to grapple with its own dilemmas and therefore to marshal the public will to change and improve itself. And I think it's that evidence of that we're seeing both in the UK and in the States. This is really important stuff. There are solutions, though, in development, and this initiative between the Coalition for Better Broadcasting and Action Station is one of them. I'd like to talk about a couple of the others. Scoop itself did some excellent analysis in a series of in-depth articles in 2014. Last year, Free Range Press published an excellent book, Don't Dream It's Over, Reimagining Journalism in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Radio New Zealand's Media Watch programme with Colin Peacock and Jeremy Rose has consistently covered both the challenges and many possible solutions. So it's not for shortage of good ideas. The Civics and Media project ran in 2015 and last year. This piece of work identified 30 great ideas, 3 specific ideas from 10 well-qualified people, 9 overriding principles, and 30 specific solutions that arose from the workshops, both in the area of media and also in the area of civics education. So they're all great resources for what to do next. But my specific approach would be that this campaign should prepare a bill to present to an incoming government at the next election. I think we need to provide for secure per capita funding for Radio New Zealand. We need to pick up Peter's idea of a ring-fenced funding mechanism by taxing the profits of media giants. We need to create a public share in the broadcast digital spectrum and radio spectrum as part of a low-cost infrastructure to allow national broadcasting of community-developed content. This would allow programmes like those from Auckland's Triangle Stratos TV to be broadcast nationally. I'd like to see Jim Blackman memorialised in an award for excellence in local television. Secondly, I think it's important to develop those civics skills in young people, but actually in all of us. We all need an information base to provide a grounding in the frameworks for seeing the world. Love, ethics, truth and justice are provided by an understanding of philosophy, systems thinking, sociology and holistic economics to understand where we fit and how we can act. This was in the Civics and Media Report as its major purpose. By 2030 it said, we need to ensure that all New Zealanders are well informed about the world they live in and have the ability and skills to bring about change. And I'd like to talk about that. I mean, I think that talking about critical thinking is not enough. We actually need this information base. We actually need a way of using our information base in order to assess what we hear and see. And particularly to allow us to deal with the pressing problems thrown up by social media's influence on media and broadcasting. How do we create a shared, not an atomised media space? And how do we move away from frictionless delivery of news, i.e. things that here's something else you might like, rather than what we really need, which is being faced with news that we wouldn't have chosen to read, the uncomfortable, challenging views and perspectives of people who are not like us and whom we might never agree with. A pluralistic and inclusive society is where we offer, is one where we offer respect to this diversity. And we also need ways of dealing with manufactured outrage. When an outright lie or a piece of outrageous behaviour gets a high profile beyond its news value, the intention is diversion. With the kind of skill set that people need, so people need this kind of skill set in order to be able to understand that that's what's happening to them, because I don't think it's going to stop. With that in mind, I'd like to say thank you again for the opportunity to address you and a great keenness to be involved in this project. Thank you.
Do you see the protection of the journalist to be paramount over the protection of the actual news media organisation?
I guess that's a complicated question. I mean, I do see that journalists need protection, but the threats are not only to individual journalists. The threats are to journalistic institutions in terms of self-censorship, in terms of a lack of courage, in terms of the kind of legislation that we see coming through that would punish journalists and their institutions from telling us the truth.
Just very briefly, I think it's about both. It's about the journalists and the institutions. If you look at ProPublica, the reason that the New York Times is putting a story on the front page of ProPublica is because it's impactful journalism that they can't afford to spend a year doing themselves. That's good for the the media outlets as well. It's good for journalists, both employed at ProPublica and the partner journalists on the New York Times as well. So I think, it's got to be, anything we talk about here, it needs to be in partnership with the mainstream media outlets that are still getting the bulk of audience in this country and need the support.
My question was around audience and mainstream media, probably more for you. The question that I have is, aren't you simply replicating? Because there is a really great investigative team in most of the mainstream media, and if they need money, and you're saying, I want money for my not-for-profit, shouldn't that money maybe go to the organisations that already have these units?
Okay, so the question was about why would you create a pot of money for investigative journalism when there are lots of media outlets that should be, potentially getting that money as well.
Of resources that are already there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there's investigative teams and that sort of thing. I think there's those investigative teams have very limited resource. ProPublica has, in their case, $10 million. I've got 30 journalists who are working on data journalism projects. They're working on investigations that are long-running, and then they're looking for an audience. And everyone is chomping at the bit to be that organisation that partners with them to launch that journalism because it's such good quality. I just don't think New Zealand Herald or Fairfax or anyone has the resource literally to do that type of stuff. It's getting better, and there's some great stuff that is coming out of those investigative teams, but we're really...
Do you think you get resource where Fairfax and NZME wouldn't?
Yeah.
Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah. I don't think a high net worth individual is necessarily going to put money into Fairfax or NZME, but they might put something into like a Next Foundation that has a charter that is independent and is going to look for the most impact regardless of what outlet it is.
The idea of having philanthropically kind of funded journalism,
Yeah.
how do you see that sitting alongside what the state responsibility is? Because I think sometimes the risk then is the state kind of goes,
we
that's
don't need
okay,
to."
they're doing it over there. And so what role is state funding got in that?
So alongside a philanthropic organisation to do public interest journalism, you'll have the state funding journalism as well. As the state just going to go, well, no, there's all this appetite, the public are putting money into this not-for-profit, why should we do it? Well, I think the scale of what I'm proposing is going to be very modest anyway. If we could raise $5 million into something like the Scoop Foundation or some new sort of mechanism that attracts these people who have a lot of money, I think it's going to take 2 or 3 years to get runs on the board. I don't really think it's going to be something that's an either or. It's going to be both.
Who funds you at the moment?
The government, yeah,
How much is
MB,
that?
750,000.
50K?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Right. How much do you think is funded by the anti-science people?
Oh.
Do you have any idea?
So Lance was talking about the Science Media Centre. Our budget's about $750,000, which is all about evidence-based journalism. But what about all the lobby groups and various vested interests out there that are funding anti-science? And I'd say it's 100 times that. It's companies that have a vested interest. It's the anti-vaxxers, it's the anti-fluoride lobby, all of that.
It might be really good to get an actual number on that or a decent estimate.
How?
I think that's completely unrealistic. And in the UK, there's just recently been a report published on the lack of transparency in so-called think tanks, and I think it would be a really interesting piece of work to replicate here because we have absolutely no idea who funds, for example, the so-called Taxpayers Union, or for that matter, the New Zealand Institute.
Can I just ask, well, we do actually know about the New Zealand Institute because it's all listed on their website, but the question I had is, so with Scoop, is the Scoop Foundation the same page that publishes PR, for example, from Family First or lobby groups like that? Is that the same organisation?
Sorry, are you asking if Scoop is the same organisation that publishes press releases? Yes, we do. We publish a lot of press releases, yes.
Right, so is that public interest?
I believe it is, yes. I'll give an example. In 2014, I got an email from an American union talking about a new trade agreement called the TISA, the Trading Services Agreement. I was confused because I'm a bit of a news hound and I wondered why I'd never heard about it. I checked every New Zealand news website. I found nothing. There was a passing reference to a previous trading services agreement on the Otago Daily Times website. Scoop Media already had 7 articles, 3 overseas ones and 4 local ones, which gave a huge amount of information about what was covered, who was involved. I put in an Official Information Act request to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and they were at that stage unprepared to even identify which sectors of New Zealand society were going to become part of the Trading Services Agreement. And it turns out that government procurement is one of those issues. So it's not a trivial, it's not a trivial matter. But and there was a reference to it in the budget documents, which no media had picked up. So that's why I think Scoop has an immense value for New Zealand.
Yeah, that's great, but you've got a huge breadth of, you might have some anti-science who are publishing press releases on, I'm not saying you're anti-science, but you know what I mean? So I think that it's quite interesting to argue for being in the public interest when you're also publishing press releases from all sorts of different sources. Some great, some not so great.
I think one of the things that Scoop does really well is that it curates the content. So for the rising stories of the day, one of the things that it does is to put all of the press releases together so that you can read, and it allows us to be critical inspectors of the news from different perspectives, and that's one of the things that doesn't happen across the rest of the media.